In the quiet town of Eatonton, Georgia, there exists a sprawling, unusual compound that has drawn attention for decades. Most outsiders knew little about it, other than it was home to a self-proclaimed spiritual leader named Malachi York, and his followers, who called themselves the Nuwaubian Nation. To followers, he was more than a leader, he was a prophet, a teacher, and the gateway to higher spiritual truth. To the surrounding community, the compound seemed bizarre, eccentric, and uncomfortably insular. But beneath the murals, Egyptian-style temples, and strange ceremonies, a more sinister reality had taken root. York arrived in Georgia in the 1990s, after years of building a following in New York. By the time he established his compound, he had amassed dozens of families who lived under his strict control, isolated from mainstream society. He dictated not only the spiritual practices, but also the very routines of daily life: what to eat, when to pray, how to educate children, and how to interact with outsiders. For years, the followers obeyed, believing that disobedience was a path to spiritual failure or divine punishment. Children were homeschooled, adults rarely left the property, and any dissent was met with intense social pressure or threats of ostracism. York claimed he was preparing his people for a coming spiritual revolution, promising wealth, power, and cosmic enlightenment. The compound became self-contained: food production, schools, rituals, and social hierarchy all under his direction. Outsiders were discouraged, and even local authorities admitted that stepping inside often felt impossible. The Nuwaubians viewed outsiders as dangerous to their spiritual mission, but behind the elaborate rituals, the control was abusive. Investigators later revealed that York had committed sexual abuse against minors over years, exploiting his position of unquestioned authority. Families who joined the Nuwaubian Nation often had no choice but to comply with his commands. Young girls were coerced into sexual relationships under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. The hierarchy was enforced not just by spiritual rhetoric, but by fear, isolation, and manipulation. The first cracks in the empire came when former members began speaking out. Adults who had grown up inside the compound described being forced into labor, indoctrinated from childhood, and kept from forming relationships outside the group. Some revealed that they had been physically and emotionally abused if they resisted York's directives. Neighbors recalled seeing children working long hours in the gardens, adults under strict surveillance, and families that never questioned York's authority, even when the laws of the outside world would normally have intervened. In 2002, the FBI launched an investigation after mounting reports of abuse, fraud, and sexual exploitation. York had been using the compound not only to control his followers, but also to launder money, falsify documents, and maintain an image of legitimacy. The agents uncovered evidence of systemic child sexual abuse, financial fraud, and manipulation so pervasive that it had taken decades to surface publicly. The trial was extensive. Former followers testified about the psychological control, the grooming of minors, and the intense fear that pervaded every aspect of life inside the compound. Prosecutors painted a picture of a community that, while outwardly cohesive, was internally fractured by coercion, secrecy, and terror. York was convicted on multiple counts, including child molestation and fraud, and sentenced to over 135 years in federal prison. Yet, despite the conviction, the cult did not completely vanish. Some factions of the Nuwaubian Nation remain active today, scattered across Georgia and neighboring states, maintaining their beliefs and rituals in smaller, more private circles. They continue to follow some of York's teachings, illustrating how powerful and persistent the control of a charismatic leader can be. Even after legal intervention, the ideological grip over his followers persists, demonstrating the long shadow a cult can cast. For the surrounding communities, the Nuwaubian Nation serves as a chilling reminder. Cults are not merely historical oddities. They operate quietly, sometimes invisibly, in towns and neighborhoods where ordinary life seems normal. And the most dangerous aspect is the manipulation of trust, faith, and loyalty, which can trap victims for decades, long before the outside world ever notices. The haunting takeaway is clear: a charismatic figure, a promised spiritual truth, and absolute control over a community can turn ordinary families into tools of exploitation, all under the guise of salvation. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the early 1970s, a small group of individuals began gathering around a man named Marshall Applewhite and his partner, Bonnie Nettles. Their goal was not political, not financial, and not social in the conventional sense. It was cosmic. Applewhite and Nettles claimed that Earth was about to be recycled, that the only way to survive was to leave the planet in spiritual transcendence, and that they, as guides, had the keys to salvation. For followers, this was more than ideology. It was the ultimate truth. Those who joined Heaven's Gate were promised immortality, spiritual elevation, and safety from the impending apocalypse. The group began modestly in Houston, Texas, and grew slowly but deliberately. Applewhite and Nettles were both enigmatic and magnetic. Applewhite, often reserved but occasionally hypnotically persuasive, would speak about the next level of existence, describing a life beyond physical form. Nettles, more practical and nurturing, reassured new recruits that obedience and discipline were sacred paths to enlightenment. Together, they crafted a message that appealed to outsiders searching for meaning, belonging, and purpose in a chaotic world. Members often left families, jobs, and communities to join the group. They signed over finances, surrendered possessions, and adopted strict communal living rules. Heaven's Gate was structured with meticulous hierarchy. New members were immediately given tasks to reinforce obedience: cleaning, preparing meals, learning doctrines, and maintaining the compound. Daily routines were designed to suppress individuality and enforce loyalty. Everyone wore identical clothing to erase personal identity. Personal desires, romantic attachments, or independent thinking were discouraged or punished through social isolation and spiritual reprimand. In addition to social control, Applewhite instilled a culture of fear and inevitability. He preached that Earth was doomed, that failure to follow him would result in annihilation. Psychological manipulation became the backbone of the cult. Members were encouraged to sever ties with outsiders, minimizing external influence and critical thought. Those who questioned the doctrine were accused of lacking spiritual insight or being spiritually doomed, a technique that effectively silenced dissent and intensified conformity. As the 1980s and 1990s progressed, the group became more reclusive. Members moved to California, purchasing a large mansion in Rancho Santa Fe to serve as both residence and fortress. They strictly limited access to outsiders. Followers were required to document their lives meticulously, write confessions, and submit personal reflections to Applewhite. Technology, once a tool of connection, became a tool of control. Applewhite monitored communications and dictated content to ensure ideological conformity. The group's lifestyle also included extreme ascetic practices. Members renounced sex, personal relationships, and material indulgences. Diet and exercise were regimented. Any deviation from rules could result in punishment, humiliation, or forced isolation. In some cases, members were made to sleep separately, work excessively, or perform physically taxing chores as a reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Psychological conditioning was constant. Daily lectures, mantra repetition, and communal discussions reinforced the cult's ideology, erasing critical thinking over time. What set Heaven's Gate apart from other cults was its apocalyptic narrative. Applewhite claimed that an alien spacecraft, traveling behind the comet Hale-Bopp, was coming to retrieve the faithful. Members were told that they must leave their earthly bodies to board the spacecraft. Dying in a controlled, ritualistic way was framed not as death but as transcendence. Obedience meant salvation. Failure meant being left behind during Earth's final recycling. This doctrine became tragically real on March 26, 1997. Nettles, who had died years earlier but whose teachings remained, and 38 followers were found dead in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe. Each had participated in a mass suicide using a combination of pheno, vodka, and plastic bags, executed in shifts over several days. Bodies were dressed identically, covered with purple shrouds, and arranged with ceremonial precision. Applewhite himself was found at the end of the sequence, a final demonstration of authority and control. The scene revealed decades of planning, ideological indoctrination, and total submission. The aftermath stunned the world. Media outlets labeled it one of the most chilling mass suicides in modern history. Authorities conducted meticulous investigations to determine whether coercion or criminal action had contributed to the deaths. What emerged was clear. Each member had voluntarily participated, convinced that this was the only path to salvation, and that disobedience would mean eternal failure. Yet the ethical and psychological ramifications of such intense manipulation sparked national debates on cult dynamics, mental coercion, and the limits of personal autonomy under spiritual duress. Psychologists and cult experts analyzed Heaven's Gate extensively in the following years. They noted patterns common to dangerous cults: isolation, authoritarian leadership, obsessive focus on doctrine, apocalyptic beliefs, and systematic erosion of personal autonomy. Applewhite's charisma, combined with Nettle's nurturing influence, created a dyad that reinforced loyalty and eliminated questioning. Social bonds within the cult became stronger than familial or societal ties, effectively creating a closed system where obedience was paramount and dissent impossible. Despite the tragedy, remnants of Heaven's Gate ideology persisted online for years. Some websites continued to espouse Applewhite's teachings, though with far fewer followers. These digital enclaves illustrate the resilience of cult ideology. Even after the death of a leader and mass fatalities, ideas can survive, adapting to new mediums and attracting those seeking certainty in uncertain times. The legacy of Heaven's Gate is both cautionary and horrifying. It demonstrates the deadly potential of combining charismatic leadership, psychological manipulation, rigid control structures, and apocalyptic promises. Parents lost children, communities were shocked, and the public was confronted with the terrifying power of belief twisted into obsession. The story raises a chilling question for audiences today. How many groups, hidden in plain sight, continue to operate under similar principles, isolating members, controlling their lives, and convincing them that obedience equals survival, even if the cost is life itself? It is a reminder that the most dangerous cults are not those of history textbooks. They are the ones that continue to operate, quietly reshaping minds and lives under the guise of faith, salvation, and spiritual guidance. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the hills near Waco, Texas, a religious community flourished under the leadership of David Koresh, a man who claimed divine insight, absolute authority, and the destiny to guide his followers through the end times. To his supporters, Koresh was more than a pastor. He was a prophet, a messiah who interpreted scripture with uncanny precision. To outsiders, the Branch Davidian compound at Mount Carmel appeared mysterious, insular, and heavily fortified, a place of devotion that grew increasingly isolated from the surrounding world. Koresh, born Vernon Howell, joined the Branch Davidians in the early 1980s and quickly rose through the ranks due to his persuasive charisma, profound understanding of scripture, and ability to inspire loyalty. By the mid-1980s, he had assumed control of the community and rebranded it under his own vision, attracting devoted followers who were willing to give him complete authority over their lives. He preached about the imminent apocalypse, emphasizing that only those who adhered strictly to his teachings would survive. Life in the compound was regimented, tightly controlled, and focused on Koresh's interpretation of biblical prophecy. Adults were required to study scripture for hours each day, learn survival techniques, and participate in communal labor. Children were raised according to strict religious and social rules. Followers were often encouraged to sever ties with family members outside the group to ensure total loyalty. Koresh exercised control over marriages, relationships, and even the education of children, making the community an isolated ecosystem under his dominion. Beneath the veneer of religious devotion, disturbing patterns emerged. Koresh exercised authoritarian power over his followers, including psychological manipulation and sexual exploitation. Several adult women, some of them very young, testified after the siege that Koresh used his religious authority to justify sexual relationships, claiming divine sanction for his actions. Children were exposed to violent teachings, militarized instruction, and apocalyptic rhetoric. The community functioned as a tightly woven hierarchy, with Koresh at the apex, enforcing obedience and suppressing dissent through fear of divine retribution and spiritual condemnation. Tensions with the outside world escalated in 1993 when allegations of illegal firearms possession, tax violations, and child abuse surfaced. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms (ATF) began investigating the compound, suspecting that Koresh and his followers were stockpiling weapons and preparing for violent confrontation. Surveillance and undercover operations confirmed large numbers of firearms, which heightened federal concern, especially given Koresh's apocalyptic preaching. Negotiations and attempts to intervene peacefully were complicated by the community's deep mistrust of outsiders and Koresh's insistence that they were fulfilling God's plan. The situation reached a climax on February 28, 1993, when the ATF attempted a raid on the compound. The initial confrontation turned deadly, resulting in a shootout that left 4 federal agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead. The failed raid triggered a tense 51-day siege, during which Koresh continued to assert control, communicating with negotiators while reinforcing apocalyptic narratives and claiming divine authority to dictate the fate of the group. The standoff was characterized by psychological manipulation, as Koresh convinced followers that surrender would mean spiritual death and that only faithfulness could ensure salvation. Inside the compound, conditions deteriorated. Followers were confined, resources were limited, and fear escalated as federal agents maintained a surrounding perimeter. Koresh maintained authority through a combination of scripture, personal charisma, and the threat of eternal damnation. He continued to instruct followers in preparation for what he claimed would be a confrontation with end-time forces. Children, women, and men alike remained obedient, largely because their worldview had been shaped to perceive obedience as the path to survival. Negotiations with federal agents continued for weeks, with occasional releases of some children and limited communications. However, the breakdown of trust and miscommunication led to a tragic conclusion on April 19, 1993, when the FBI launched an assault using tear gas to force the occupants to surrender. A fire erupted inside the compound under circumstances that remained controversial. By the end of the day, 76 individuals, including David Koresh, perished. Among the dead were men, women, and children, many of whom had been fully indoctrinated into Koresh's apocalyptic vision and who believed that surrender would bring divine punishment. The aftermath of the Waco siege left a lasting impact on the United States. Families of survivors struggled with grief, trauma, and anger at both Koresh and the federal authorities. The tragedy sparked nationwide debates about government overreach, the dangers of cult leadership, and the vulnerability of isolated communities to extreme ideologies. The compound, once a center of religious devotion, became a symbol of catastrophic faith, authoritarian control, and the deadly consequences of unchecked charisma. Investigators and psychologists analyzing the Branch Davidians highlighted several key factors that allowed Koresh to maintain power over the group. Isolation from the outside world, the creation of an all-encompassing belief system, strict enforcement of obedience, and the use of fear as a tool of control. These mechanisms, combined with apocalyptic ideology, created a community in which rational dissent was nearly impossible and survival was equated with unwavering loyalty. Even decades later, the story of the Branch Davidians serves as a warning about the enduring power of cults. It illustrates how charismatic leaders can manipulate religious doctrine, exploit psychological vulnerabilities, and create closed systems where obedience overrides personal morality. The lessons remain relevant for law enforcement, psychologists, and communities seeking to identify and intervene in dangerous cults before tragedy strikes. The haunting reflection is clear: when belief becomes absolute and authority goes unchallenged, devotion can become deadly. How many communities today may be quietly following similar doctrines, awaiting guidance from a leader whose words could determine life or death? The Branch Davidians demonstrate that faith, when manipulated by a charismatic leader, can become a cage that isolates, controls, and ultimately destroys, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions, broken families, and collective trauma that reverberates far beyond the compound walls. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the late 1960s, a small group of young adults in California began following a charismatic evangelist named David Berg, known as the Children of God. The group promised liberation, spiritual fulfillment, and a sense of belonging to anyone who joined. To outsiders, the group's mission seemed rooted in love, community, and devotion. To members, however, the organization became a labyrinth of control, coercion, and abuse. Families were fractured, children indoctrinated, and the very concept of consent distorted under Berg's doctrine. David Berg was a complex figure, part preacher, part cult leader, part manipulator. He preached an extreme interpretation of Christianity, emphasizing free love and divine sexuality as a path to spiritual enlightenment. Initially, This message attracted young, idealistic followers, seeking freedom from traditional religious and societal structures. They were drawn to the promise of a utopia, a community where rules of conventional society no longer applied, and where spiritual authority superseded all else. The early days were marked by communal living, missionary work, and outreach programs. Children born into the group were often educated within the community, shielded from the outside world, and indoctrinated from a very young age. Adults were expected to adhere strictly to Berg's teachings, which included radical sexual practices. The doctrine of flirty fishing, in particular, encouraged female members to use sexual relationships, sometimes with strangers, as a form of evangelism. While Berg framed this as spiritual work, it quickly became exploitative, coercive, and abusive. Over the years, allegations began to surface about sexual abuse within the group. Children described being exposed to sexual activity from a young age, pressured into sexual relationships, and manipulated into believing that obedience to Berg's teachings was necessary for spiritual survival. Parents who were followers often participated in the practices themselves, blurring boundaries and making it nearly impossible for children to escape or seek help. The community's isolation reinforced this dynamic. Living on compounds or in remote locations, members had little contact with outsiders who might question the practices or intervene. Berg maintained control through a combination of charisma, doctrinal authority, and strict internal hierarchy. Letters, teachings, and directives were distributed regularly, dictating everything from sexual practices to labor, prayer schedules, and social interactions. Members who questioned the leader or resisted his orders faced ostracism, spiritual condemnation, and emotional manipulation. Those who tried to leave were often subjected to public shaming, emotional coercion, or threats of spiritual damnation. By the 1980s and 1990s, the group had spread internationally, establishing communities in Europe, Africa, and South America. Despite its global expansion, allegations of abuse followed the organization. Former members came forward to describe long-term sexual exploitation, manipulation of children, and strict authoritarian control that persisted across continents. The community's growth did not hide the fact that Berg had used his position to enforce compliance and exploit the vulnerable, particularly minors. Legal action against the children of God began sporadically as ex-members testified about abuse. Authorities discovered evidence of child sexual abuse, psychological coercion, and manipulative indoctrination. Internationally, countries investigated the organization, particularly regarding flirty fishing and other practices that endangered minors. The leader, David Berg, died in 1994, but his teachings continued to shape the organization under new leadership, and factions of the Children of God still operate today under the name the Family International, often denying or minimizing past abuses while continuing communal practices that raise ethical concerns. The aftermath for victims has been devastating and lifelong. Many former members report difficulties in adjusting to life outside the cult, struggling with trauma, trust issues, and the psychological imprint of decades-long manipulation. Children raised in the group often lacked formal education or socialization skills outside the community, making integration into mainstream society challenging. Survivors also report difficulty processing the betrayal of parental figures who participated in the abusive practices, compounding the psychological damage. Psychologists analyzing the Children of God cite several core mechanisms that enabled the group's abuses: isolation, control of knowledge, manipulation of morality, and the creation of an insular environment in which dissent was impossible. Berg's emphasis on divine authority created a structure where questioning leadership was framed as sin or disobedience to God. Over time, members' identities were subsumed into the group's ideology, and the distinction between personal choice and coercion became nearly non-existent. The legacy of the Children of God is a cautionary tale about the dangers of charismatic authority combined with isolation and manipulation. Even decades after Berg's death, the organization continues to operate in various forms, demonstrating the durability of cult structures and the lingering power of ideology over individual autonomy. The psychological, social, and spiritual consequences for members and victims remain profound, and the haunting question for audiences is unavoidable. How many communities today continue to operate under similar principles, presenting themselves as spiritual havens, while systematically exploiting the vulnerable and controlling lives under the guise of divine authority? The story of the children of God reminds us that cults are not always relics of the past. They can persist, adapt, and continue to manipulate, isolate, and exploit, long after the original leader is gone. Faith can be a sanctuary, but in the wrong hands, it can become a prison. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the late 1960s, California was a place of cultural upheaval, of flower children, music, and countercultural experimentation. Amid this environment, a man named Charles Manson emerged, drawing together a small, devoted group of young followers into a commune that would later become synonymous with terror. To outsiders, he was a charming, eccentric drifter, full of cryptic philosophies. To his followers, he was a prophet, a visionary, and a messiah who promised liberation from societal constraints and entrance into a higher state of consciousness. But behind the veil of idealism and communal living, Manson's ideology twisted into obsession, control, and ultimately, murder. Manson's early life was turbulent. He had spent much of it in reform schools and prisons, gaining a deep understanding of manipulation and power over vulnerable individuals. He gravitated toward young people who were disillusioned, emotionally fragile, and searching for meaning in a society undergoing profound transformation. He promised them freedom, acceptance, and a community where they could escape the perceived oppression of mainstream culture. By the mid-1960s, his family had gathered in the California desert, and later at Spahn Ranch, a dilapidated movie set that became the epicenter of their activities. Daily life within the Manson family was structured around absolute obedience to Manson. Members were subject to constant psychological manipulation, praising them when they conformed, shaming them when they expressed doubts, and isolating anyone who resisted. Manson used music, drugs, and apocalyptic prophecies to create an environment in which followers would relinquish personal autonomy and identity. Young women, in particular, were vulnerable, drawn into a system of emotional dependency and sexual control, convinced that their devotion was a path to enlightenment and survival. Manson's teachings included a combination of pseudo-religious ideology, racial apocalyptic prophecy, and personal domination. He preached about an impending racial war he called helter-skelter, claiming that his family must prepare to survive and rule afterward. Every member's life was subordinated to this ideology, with Manson controlling their movements, interactions, and even their intimate relationships. Members were encouraged to abandon families, sever social ties, and accept Manson's directives as divine command. The cult's operations were fueled by drug use, psychological coercion, and a rigid hierarchy. Manson exerted control not only over daily activities, but also over thought processes, beliefs, and emotions. Followers were often isolated from outside influence, immersed in communal life, and subjected to long sessions of indoctrination through repetition, music, and ritual. The combination of drugs and emotional dependency made questioning Manson nearly impossible. Resistance was framed as spiritual failure or disloyalty to the group. In the summer of 1969, Manson's control turned deadly. Seeking to ignite the apocalyptic war he had predicted, he directed his followers to commit a series of brutal murders in Los Angeles. The most infamous of these occurred on August 8th to 9th, when followers brutally murdered actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, and 4 others in her home. The following night, Manson orchestrated additional killings at the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. The methods were horrific. Victims were stabbed, beaten, and mutilated, with messages carved into walls, intended to spread terror and signal the onset of helter-skelter. The investigation that followed revealed the terrifying extent of Manson's psychological control. Law enforcement found that the murders were not random acts of violence but carefully planned, executed under Manson's direct influence. Followers were entirely obedient, carrying out brutal acts without hesitation, convinced that they were serving a higher purpose. Manson himself, despite not personally committing the murders, was held responsible under the legal concept of conspiracy and was ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. The aftermath of the Manson family murders left the nation horrified. Families grieved, communities were shaken, and the media sensationalized every detail of the case. Psychologists and criminologists analyzed the group, highlighting the ways in which a charismatic leader can manipulate vulnerable individuals into committing unspeakable acts. The case became a benchmark for understanding cult dynamics, illustrating the lethal combination of authority, ideology, isolation, and psychological manipulation. Even decades later, the Manson family serves as a chilling example of how ordinary people can be drawn into extraordinary evil. The group's ability to isolate members, suppress critical thinking, and normalize extreme behaviors demonstrates the profound dangers of unchecked charismatic authority. Manson's death in 2017 did not erase the psychological scars inflicted on survivors, families, or society at large. The story continues to serve as a stark warning about the seductive power of cult leaders and the destructive consequences of absolute obedience. The lasting question for the audience is unavoidable. How can a single individual, armed with charisma, ideology, and the ability to manipulate minds, lead others to commit horrific acts that they might have never imagined themselves capable of? The Manson family is a dark testament to the enduring threat of cults. Even in modern society, where information is widely accessible and awareness of cult tactics is greater, the core dynamics, charismatic authority, isolation, and psychological manipulation, remain potent. The story reminds us that faith, loyalty, and idealism, when exploited by a dangerous leader, can transform communities, destroy lives, and leave a legacy of fear that endures long after the leader is gone. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the late 1980s, a secretive organization emerged, blending mysticism, apocalyptic prophecy, and ritualistic control over its members. Known as the Order of the Solar Temple, it was founded in Switzerland by Joseph D. Mambro and Luc Jouret, later expanding into France, Canada, and other countries. To followers, the group represented a path to spiritual enlightenment, the promise of ascension to higher planes of existence, and the opportunity to escape the perceived corruption and chaos of the modern world. To outsiders, however, the Solar Temple appeared increasingly sinister, secretive, and disturbingly manipulative. D. Mambro and Jouret were masterful in their ability to attract followers. Both were charismatic, intelligent, and persuasive, offering an image of spiritual authority and deep knowledge. D. Mambro was the quiet strategist, emphasizing discipline, loyalty, and hierarchical structure. Jouret, a former physician, embodied mysticism and the allure of otherworldly wisdom. Together, they created a compelling narrative. Life on Earth was transient, and only those who followed the Solar Temple's teachings would survive to join a higher cosmic order. This blend of fear, hope, and esoteric knowledge drew in wealthy, educated, and often vulnerable individuals searching for meaning. Life inside the Solar Temple was highly structured. Members adhered to strict routines, including meditation, study of esoteric texts, and rituals that reinforced obedience. Financial contributions were expected, and followers were encouraged to sever ties with the outside world to prevent influence from skeptics or those unworthy of the path. Social isolation, combined with intense indoctrination, created an environment where D. Mambro and Jouret's word was unquestionable. Questioning the leaders, or even hesitating in spiritual practices, was framed as moral failure or a threat to the group's collective destiny. The group also fostered a culture of fear, blending apocalyptic prophecy with existential dread. Followers were taught that the world outside was corrupt, doomed, and incapable of sustaining life. Only the chosen, those who adhered to the Solar Temple's strict hierarchy and teachings, would ascend to higher planes upon death. This narrative, reinforced by ritual and psychological pressure, bound members tightly to the organization. Individual desires, skepticism, or reluctance were overridden by promises of spiritual salvation and eternal life. By the early 1990s, the Solar Temple had grown substantially, with hundreds of adherents across multiple countries. However, troubling reports began to emerge. Some former members described manipulation, coercion, and intense psychological pressure. Others warned that D. Mambro and Jouret encouraged preparations for a dramatic exit from Earth, framing death as a spiritual transition rather than a tragedy. The signs of impending catastrophe were present, but outsiders struggled to intervene, as the group was both secretive and highly organized. In 1994, the warnings became a horrifying reality. In Switzerland and France, authorities discovered multiple mass deaths involving members of the Solar Temple. Bodies were found arranged ceremoniously, often dressed in ritualistic garb, with indications of both murder and ritual suicide. Many victims had been heavily sedated, making it clear that compliance was enforced through chemical as well as psychological means. Investigators concluded that these deaths were not isolated incidents but part of a coordinated plan orchestrated by the leadership, designed to facilitate what the cult termed ascension to the next level. The investigation revealed a chilling picture of manipulation and control. Followers had been gradually conditioned to accept death as a necessary step in their spiritual journey. Letters, journals, and testimonies described DiMambro and Jarrett presenting this final act as both inevitable and glorious. Many victims had willingly participated, convinced that they were achieving spiritual liberation, yet coercion and fear were pervasive, blurring the lines between voluntary action and manipulation. Over the next several years, additional deaths were uncovered in Canada, revealing that the pattern was international. In total, over 70 members perished in ritualistic circumstances tied to the solar temple, making it one of the deadliest cult-related incidents of the late 20th century. The scale of the tragedy highlighted the destructive potential of apocalyptic ideology. When combined with charismatic leadership, strict control, and the isolation of members from outside influences, legal proceedings against the leaders were limited by their deaths in many cases, as DiMambro and Jarrett were found among the deceased in the initial incidents. However, authorities pursued investigations into accomplices and organizational structures, uncovering financial exploitation, fraudulent practices, and evidence of planning that facilitated the mass deaths. The psychological, social, and spiritual mechanisms at play became the subject of academic and law enforcement analysis, contributing to understanding how cults maintain control and why members comply even in the face of death. The aftermath for surviving families and communities was devastating. Parents lost adult children who had been convinced to leave homes and sever familial ties. Friends and colleagues were left grappling with the incomprehensible nature of the events. Survivors reported long-term trauma, difficulties reintegrating into society, and persistent psychological effects from their experiences in the group. The communities around the compound were shaken, confronting the reality that such manipulation could lead to coordinated mass death under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. Psychologists studying the solar temple highlighted several key factors enabling such control: charismatic authority, apocalyptic narrative, isolation from societal norms, and the creation of a closed system in which obedience became a survival mechanism. The leaders exploited followers' search for meaning and belonging, transforming devotion into a tool of ultimate control. The deliberate framing of death as ascension demonstrates the horrifying lengths to which cult leaders can manipulate belief to achieve compliance. Even decades later, the story of the solar temple serves as a warning about the persistent danger of cults. While the original organization no longer exists in its full form, its ideology and methods are instructive. Groups operating today may use similar psychological techniques, cloaked in spiritual or ideological rhetoric, to exert influence over vulnerable individuals. The lessons of the solar temple emphasize vigilance, understanding of cult dynamics, and awareness of the signs of manipulation before tragedy occurs. The chilling reflection remains: how many groups today may be quietly shaping the beliefs, behaviors, and even lives of their members, under the guise of spiritual enlightenment, while orchestrating their destiny according to the leader's vision. The order of the solar temple is a stark reminder that devotion, when exploited by manipulative leaders, can become deadly. Spiritual pursuit, communal loyalty, and ideological adherence, when weaponized by those in power, can culminate in unimaginable tragedy, leaving behind communities and families forever altered, and a haunting legacy that serves as both warning and testament to the dangers of unchecked authority. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the early 1970s, a quiet Canadian town became the epicenter of one of the most disturbing cults in North American history. Known as the Anthill Kids, this group was led by a man named Paul Schäfer, a former German preacher with ties to abusive ideologies and an authoritarian background. Though the group was technically based in Canada, its operations, members, and influence extended to the US, drawing attention from both countries' authorities. To outsiders, it appeared as an isolated religious commune. To those who joined, it was an all-encompassing world controlled by Schäfer, where obedience was demanded, dissent punished, and fear used as a constant instrument of control. Paul Schäfer arrived in Canada in the early 1970s, fleeing prosecution in Germany for crimes involving child abuse. Charismatic, seemingly spiritual, and persuasive, He established the commune in the town of Saint-Anne-de-Bellevue, Quebec, attracting families seeking a devout, disciplined lifestyle. His followers were promised a life of moral purity, discipline, and spiritual enlightenment. For Schäfer, this was an opportunity to exercise unchecked authority, build a loyal following, and insulate his actions from external scrutiny. Daily life within the commune was regimented. Children and adults alike were subjected to strict routines, including long hours of manual labor, religious study, and public confessions of perceived sins. Individual identity was suppressed, with communal living enforcing dependence on the group and its leader. Education, recreation, and even meals were dictated by Schäfer and his inner circle, ensuring that members internalized obedience as both practical necessity and spiritual duty. The control extended into the psychological and sexual realms. Schäfer exploited his position as a spiritual leader to commit sexual abuse against children, framing his acts as divine instruction. Families indoctrinated by decades of strict religious ideology either participated willingly or remained silent, convinced that Schäfer's authority was unquestionable. Children were especially vulnerable, raised in an environment where dissent was equated with sin or spiritual failure. Emotional manipulation, fear of punishment, and isolation from society reinforced this hierarchy, creating an environment in which abuse could continue unchecked for years. Members were instructed to sever ties with the outside world, letters were censored, outside friendships discouraged, and those attempting to leave faced intimidation or public shaming. This isolation ensured that few could intervene, giving Schäfer a near-total grip on the lives of his followers. Even minor infractions were punished, often through labor, humiliation, or threats of divine retribution. This fear-driven obedience became the mechanism through which Schäfer maintained control, ensuring the commune's cohesion and secrecy. The commune's practices drew attention in the 1980s and 1990s when former members began speaking out. They described pervasive physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, long-term psychological conditioning, and the total domination of personal freedoms. Authorities were slow to intervene, in part due to the commune's geographic isolation and Schäfer's careful management of public appearances, portraying himself as a moral, spiritual guide. However, investigative journalists, social workers, and law enforcement gradually uncovered the scale of the exploitation. Legal investigations revealed shocking evidence. Schäfer had maintained meticulous control over finances, manipulated legal documents, and constructed an internal system that allowed abuse to continue undetected. Children were denied adequate education and exposed to sexualized indoctrination. Followers who attempted to resist or leave were threatened with ostracism or retaliation. Interviews with survivors painted a consistent picture of fear, coercion, and psychological manipulation, illustrating the depth of Schäfer's influence. The cult's influence extended beyond Canada. Some former members relocated to the US, spreading the doctrine, recruiting new followers, and maintaining secretive operations. Reports indicated that Schäfer had correspondence with sympathetic individuals in the US, some of whom adopted the commune's rigid ideologies and sought to replicate the controlled environment in smaller groups. This transnational aspect highlighted the challenges of monitoring cult activity, particularly when leaders operated across borders, insulated by secrecy, and protected by loyal followers. In 1996, after decades of abuse, Schäfer was finally arrested in Chile, where he had fled to avoid prosecution. Legal proceedings confirmed years of sexual abuse, fraud, and psychological manipulation. He was extradited to Germany, where he faced additional charges for his crimes against children. His arrest marked the collapse of the formal commune, though fragments of the ideology continued among followers who remained loyal to his teachings. Many former members struggled to reintegrate into society, carrying with them trauma, distrust, and lifelong psychological scars. The aftermath of the Anthill Kids operations underscores the enduring danger of cults. Families were torn apart, children's lives irreparably harmed, and communities left grappling with the hidden crimes committed within their midst. Psychologists studying the case emphasized the mechanisms that enabled Schäfer's control: isolation, the creation of an omnipotent leader figure, rigorous enforcement of obedience, and the manipulation of moral and religious beliefs. These techniques created an environment in which individuals were stripped of autonomy and made complicit, willingly or not, in sustaining the leader's power. Even decades later, the story serves as a cautionary tale. Variants of the Anthill Kids' methods: charismatic leadership, psychological manipulation, and insular community structures remain in modern cults, often less visible but equally dangerous. The persistence of these dynamics highlights the need for awareness, vigilance, and intervention when signs of coercive control appear. The haunting reflection for audiences is unavoidable. How many communities today may still operate under the guise of spiritual guidance, manipulating lives, exploiting the vulnerable, and isolating members from the outside world? While their leaders evade scrutiny for decades, the Anthill Kids demonstrate that even seemingly idyllic communities can harbor extraordinary cruelty. Faith, when weaponized by manipulative leaders, becomes a prison. Obedience, when enforced through fear and isolation, can perpetuate exploitation across decades and borders. The story is a stark reminder that vigilance, awareness, and understanding of cult dynamics are essential to prevent history from repeating itself in new forms. Often under the guise of spiritual or ideological legitimacy, what part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the late 1970s, a new religious group emerged in the United States that promised spiritual enlightenment, purpose, and communal belonging. Known as the Church of Bible Understanding, it was founded by Klaus Beck, a charismatic yet domineering figure whose teachings quickly drew followers, particularly young adults seeking direction during a period of cultural upheaval. To outsiders, the group appeared to be a simple, devout Christian organization. To those who joined, it became a rigid, manipulative environment where obedience was enforced, critical thought discouraged, and personal freedoms subordinated to the leader's authority. Klaus Beckgaard, born in Denmark, arrived in the United States in the 1970s, bringing with him a vision of a disciplined, faith-driven community. He positioned himself as the sole interpreter of God's will, demanding unquestioned obedience from his followers. The group promised spiritual salvation, meaningful work, and a close-knit community, but its practices masked a darker reality of coercion, exploitation, and control. Beckgaard's teachings were layered with apocalyptic warnings, moral absolutism, and an insistence that the faithful submit completely to his guidance. Daily life within the Church of Bible Understanding was tightly structured. Members lived communally, often in densely packed urban residences, working long hours to support the church financially. Young followers were indoctrinated into a strict moral and behavioral code, with every aspect of their lives monitored. Personal decisions, romantic relationships, and even social interactions were subject to scrutiny and approval by church authorities. Obedience was reinforced through praise, public affirmation, and, conversely, through shaming, isolation, or spiritual condemnation for those who questioned the hierarchy. One of the most troubling aspects of the Church of Bible Understanding was the financial exploitation of its members. Followers were expected to contribute large portions of their earnings to the organization, often relinquishing personal assets to maintain the church's operations. Beckgaard and his inner circle controlled finances meticulously, ensuring that dependence on the church was absolute. Those who resisted or hesitated to comply faced manipulation and pressure, reinforcing a cycle of economic and emotional dependency. The church operated a number of businesses under its control, with members working in restaurants, cafes, and publications, often for minimal or no pay. While funds were funneled to the leadership, the church also exercised strict control over ideology and thought. Education, media consumption, and external relationships were restricted to prevent members from encountering conflicting ideas. Beckgaard delivered frequent sermons, writings, and directives emphasizing the spiritual superiority of the church, the corruption of the outside world, and the moral imperative of obedience. Through these methods, members internalized the belief that their devotion and labor were not only spiritually necessary, but essential for their salvation and the church's survival. Reports and testimonies from former members revealed the psychological manipulation pervasive within the church. Followers described long-term indoctrination, where fear, guilt, and shame were used to enforce compliance. Romantic and sexual relationships were tightly controlled, with the leader asserting moral authority over private matters. Children raised within the church were taught to prioritize obedience above personal well-being, and dissent was framed as spiritual failure or moral weakness. Many members struggled with cognitive dissonance, torn between loyalty to the church and awareness of exploitation and abuse. Over the decades, the church became notorious for its coercive practices and manipulative control. Investigations by journalists, law enforcement, and former members uncovered patterns of abuse, including financial exploitation, emotional coercion, and psychological manipulation. However, Beckgard's careful cultivation of loyalty and the insular nature of the community often prevented external scrutiny from having immediate effect. The church's survival relied on secrecy, obedience, and the internalization of authority, all of which allowed abusive practices to persist for years. The consequences for members and their families were profound. Many former followers reported lasting psychological trauma, difficulties in reintegrating into society, and ongoing struggles with financial and personal autonomy. The manipulation and control exerted by Beckgard and the church leadership left deep emotional scars, particularly for those who had joined as young adults or children. Families outside the church were often alienated, as the group's teachings encouraged severing external ties to maintain internal cohesion. Legal and psychological analysis of the Church of Bible Understanding highlighted several mechanisms of control, common to dangerous cults: isolation from external influence, centralized authority vested in a charismatic leader, indoctrination through repetitive teachings and ritual, and systematic exploitation of members, labor, and resources. These mechanisms created a closed environment in which critical thought was discouraged, autonomy was eroded, and obedience became both a survival strategy and a moral imperative. Even today, remnants of the church continued to operate in various forms, though diminished in size and influence. The story of the Church of Bible Understanding underscores the enduring nature of cult dynamics. The combination of ideology, charisma, control, and exploitation can persist across decades, adapting to new contexts while maintaining the core mechanisms of manipulation. Survivors continue to testify about their experiences, emphasizing the psychological and spiritual impact of prolonged exposure to coercive authority and absolute obedience. The chilling reflection for audiences is unavoidable. How many groups today continue to operate under the guise of faith, manipulating devotion and exploiting loyalty, while maintaining strict control over every aspect of their followers' lives? The Church of Bible Understanding is a stark reminder that even in modern society, spiritual pursuit can become a trap when power is concentrated in the hands of manipulative leaders. Faith can be a source of inspiration and community, but when weaponized by authority, it can erode autonomy, exploit the vulnerable, and leave lasting damage on lives and communities. The story serves as a warning, illustrating that vigilance, awareness, and understanding of cult dynamics are essential to prevent the repetition of such abuses in contemporary groups. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the early 1970s, a religious movement emerged in the United States that combined New Age spirituality, apocalyptic prophecy, and a fascination with extraterrestrial life. Known as Heaven's Gate, it was founded by Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, who became the charismatic figures at the center of the movement. Two followers, Applewhite and Nettles, were guiding them toward salvation, offering a path to escape the corruption and limitations of Earth. To outsiders, the group appeared eccentric, cloistered, and increasingly isolated, yet its ultimate impact would shock the world and leave a chilling legacy. Marshall Applewhite, a former music teacher from Texas, was a complex and enigmatic figure, intelligent, persuasive, and deeply charismatic. He found his calling in guiding individuals toward what he described as a higher evolutionary state. Bonnie Nettles, known as T, was a nurse with spiritual insight who joined Applewhite in creating a theology that fused Christian eschatology, UFO beliefs, and rigorous behavioral discipline. Together, they cultivated a doctrine that promised transcendence through obedience, asceticism, and spiritual preparation. Life within Heaven's Gate was highly regimented. Members adopted strict dietary rules, clothing codes, and a communal lifestyle designed to minimize attachment to the material world. Personal relationships, sexuality, and emotional expression were tightly controlled, framed as distractions from spiritual progress. Applewhite emphasized detachment from worldly desires, teaching that only through complete renunciation and obedience could members ascend to the next level, a term for the alleged extraterrestrial salvation awaiting those who completed the program. The group's isolation was both physical and psychological. Members were encouraged to cut ties with family and friends outside the movement, believing that outsiders were spiritually unenlightened and potentially corrupting. Communication with the outside world was restricted, with the internet, media, and other societal influences framed as distractions from spiritual purpose. Daily routines included meditation, study of Applewhite's writings, communal labor, and rigorous self-discipline. Individual identity was emphasized in favor of collective purpose and absolute obedience to leadership. Psychological control was central to the group's power. Applewhite and Nettles used a combination of charisma, fear of exclusion, and promises of salvation to maintain compliance. Members were taught that questioning authority was equivalent to spiritual failure and would jeopardize their ascension. Peer pressure reinforced adherence, as the group maintained tight social bonds and constant surveillance of behavior. The combination of spiritual promise and fear created an environment in which obedience was perceived as both desirable and necessary for survival. The group became increasingly secretive in the 1980s and 1990s. After Nettles' death in 1985, Applewhite intensified his messaging, claiming that he and his followers were preparing to leave Earth physically and spiritually. The doctrine evolved to include the belief that a spacecraft would come to transport them to a higher plane, and that death on Earth could facilitate this ascension. The teachings framed self-denial, communal living, and obedience as essential preparation for the transition, creating a controlled environment in which members internalized the idea that their lives on Earth were temporary and secondary to the ultimate mission. By the 1990s, Heaven's Gate had relocated to California, living in large, modest houses where every aspect of life was monitored and regulated. Followers meticulously documented their routines, maintained strict hygiene and grooming standards, and adhered to Applewhite's guidance on diet, work, and behavior. The group also adopted unique cultural identifiers, matching clothing, specific hairstyles, and a highly controlled social environment that reinforced group cohesion and distinction from the outside world. Tragically, the movement culminated in 1997 with the mass suicide of 39 members in Rancho Santa Fe, California. The individuals, ranging in age from young adults to middle-aged members, were found dressed identically, with plastic bags over their heads, reclining neatly in rows. The act was carefully planned, with the members believing that their physical deaths would allow them to board a spacecraft trailing the Hale-Bopp comet, fulfilling the prophecy of ascension to the next level. The meticulous nature of the preparations, from clothing to orderly arrangement, reflected the intense control and indoctrination exerted by Applewhite, who died alongside his followers. Investigations revealed the extent of psychological manipulation and absolute obedience within the group. Applewhite had cultivated an environment where rational skepticism was suppressed, and where loyalty to his vision was equated with spiritual survival. Members voluntarily relinquished personal autonomy, family ties, and even their lives, convinced that they were following a divinely ordained plan. Journals, letters, and video recordings uncovered during the investigation illustrated the depth of devotion and the effectiveness of long-term indoctrination. The aftermath of the Heaven's Gate tragedy left families and communities struggling to comprehend the scale of the manipulation. Loved ones who had joined the group willingly did so under extreme psychological influence, raising complex questions about consent, free will, and the power of charismatic authority. Media coverage sensationalized the event, but experts in psychology and cult studies used the case to understand how ideological control, isolation, and promises of transcendence can lead to extreme outcomes. Psychologists analyzing Heaven's Gate highlighted the key elements that enabled Applewhite's control: ideological indoctrination, social isolation, rigid lifestyle rules, and the creation of an ultimate, unquestionable goal. These mechanisms made members susceptible to extreme obedience, including the ultimate act of self-destruction. The case demonstrates the enduring dangers of cult dynamics, particularly when leaders combine charismatic authority with promises of transcendence or esoteric knowledge. Even decades later, the story of Heaven's Gate serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of surrendering autonomy to charismatic authority. The group's tragic end underscores how belief, when manipulated, can override self-preservation instincts and critical thinking. The psychological imprint on surviving families and observers remains profound, illustrating the long-term consequences of such extreme devotion. The haunting reflection for audiences is unavoidable. How far can belief be stretched when charismatic leaders promise salvation? higher purpose, and the ultimate escape from earthly existence, and what prevents such tragedies from occurring again in hidden communities today. Heaven's Gate reminds us that spiritual pursuit, when controlled and manipulated, can become deadly. Even in an age of information, vulnerability to charisma, isolation, and absolute authority persists. The story serves as both a historical account and a warning. Unchecked control over belief and behavior can transform faith into a prison, devotion into compulsion, and hope into tragedy. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive. Every story you've seen today reveals the power of manipulation, the danger of blind obedience, and the chilling reality that some communities continue to operate in secrecy, exploiting the vulnerable under the guise of faith or ideology. Don't miss our next exploration into the dark corners of human behavior, where truth is stranger and darker than fiction.